with licenses to kill, brand name businessmen footing the bill, blood everywhere. Private armies, private armies, private armies, private armies, private armies. Vernon and Norman just sat in their mini and the skinheads beat shit out of a person on the pavement. Blood everywhere. Little boys like dressing up. Little boys like dressing up in uniform. Little boys' toys blow things up. Little boys' toys blow things up. If the heavy metal boys or the boys in blue don't like the look of you, uh-oh, really out of order, really out of order, really out of order, really out of order. Vernon and Norman just sat in their mini while the skinheads beat shit out of a person on the pavement. What else could they do? They were trapped. Blood everywhere. Don't look away, because it's happening today. It's like a dread rerun of historic tension. Yes, wicked things we forgot and done. Yes, they're still marching on. Why the fear of the other? Reflex hate of the stranger. We must stand all together to make sense of the future. Living on a volcano, we don't know when it's gonna blow. Must maintain our philosophy of empathy. Empathy, am I right? Only empathy is gonna get us through these times. They will manipulate. They will manufacture hate. We must know our enemy and where it's toxic for us to be. We have to be our own private army, our own private army. So now, in conclusion, before we go to the literary meat of the soiree with Zoe Howe.
Hey! Lady Zoe Howe.
Miss Zoe Howe. A new song from the album With Youth, Russian Dolls. He was legal when I met him. Then they changed his status. Should I just forget him? Though he's lover, father, brother, now he's going into hiding. Secret life forbidden. 10 cities under freeways, praying they won't find him. It was just a piece of paper, but it said that I could stay here, and we're here all legendary Youth of Killing Joke and elsewhere. Thank you, Youth. And now, well, I suppose we're going to the literary aspect. So I'm actually going to read a bit and then we're going to do our Q&A. You take your time, there's no rush. You can hang around on the stage if you want, or you can bugger off and get over Glastonbury. He can put his feet up, it's a happening.
Thank you, lovely.
Thanks for everything. Yeah. The thing is, me and Youth have just done an album, right? And that is my first ever album.
Yeah.
So I think it's flipping the script on the usual narrative. And we very much enjoyed making it. And I'm glad you seem to enjoy listening to it. But actually, it segues very smoothly into the book. Because as I was researching the book, which took me over 2 years researching and writing this book, I discovered that I think everybody in this room, all hipsters, everybody knows it has not really been a given for females in music. And I have to say that certain compilations like Chicks on Speed's Girl Monster and more recently Sharon Signs to Cherry Red have been a reminder of how we never really got to hear many women's voices. And when women started, they were often sort of stopped even more than is usual in pop culture, which is anyway a very, very fickle culture. So, and also the legacy of women artists really has been often erased, even more than the guys, you know, even factoring in that pop is a transient and fickle medium. So when I was researching this book, one of the really amazing things I found was, that I was actually not the only woman to have returned to music. There's a number of women, including the group Malaria and all sorts of bands in here who, you know, women who have returned to music, because I think there is a zeitgeist shift happening. And I think that audiences have missed the voices of women, that they have been denied by the broader patriarchal culture, and that is just that. Does this resonate with anyone in this room?
Yeah.
Good. So, you know, anyway, I suppose it starts personally, because it is personal. It's a sort of herstory book, but yet there are elements of memoir, because I found my own story to be inextricable from the story I was telling. And this thing of doing a record with Youth, I'm not alone in returning and being called back. So let us begin at the beginning, which is actually the beginning, December 11th, 1976, excuse me, when I say suddenly there seemed to be an awful lot of women musicians or women bands in the Sounds gig guide. It seems that a women's underground is suddenly emerging overground. When women perform a professional, hard-rocking set with no concession to female stereotypes, they're an automatic threat. They're a threat to men because they challenge male supremacy in a citadel that's never been attacked before, and they threaten women who perhaps never dared acknowledge that they want to be on stage too, doing the energizing, instead of watching their boyfriends do it in passive admiration. That's what I wrote in Sounds, December 11th, 1976. So, you know, that turned out to be maybe the first, or certainly one of the very first women in rock stories. I have to say that over the years, they have become rather a staple of music journalism. And it's always a bittersweet thing, you know, because you think, well, why isn't there a men in music issue? Why not? Why has it got to be just this women in music ghetto? But still, at this point, the work needs to be done. So it all began with glitter. My love of glitter started even before David Bowie. Shaking those clear amber plastic maracas seamed with flecks of gold in a percussion dance set named after the band leader Victor Sylvester. How many in this room remember him? Good old Vic, yeah. The scene is set in northwest London, early 1960s. My father, Max, who was a musician, plays his violin. Incidentally, the violin with which he escaped from Germany in the war, that was what he brought with him, was his violin. My big sister Judy is on keyboards, that is, our piano. Myself and middle sister Susan hold down the percussion and sing. All three of us girls do. Judy now says I had it easy because I was the youngest and she fought the battles to stay out late. But looking back, I felt like I was always the one being told what to do, except for when we were singing. Then it was understood that I was the one who heard the harmonies and could tell them the notes. Despite its punk identification, Sounds was typical of the world of work in the London music industry. Even when I had woman-handled my way to features editor, conducting editorial meetings meant dodging a barrage of attempted gender/career genocide. My writers, all white and all boys, insisted, and this is a fact, they were like, women don't buy music, women don't make music, women don't listen to music. Yeah, that was the way they thought. Women don't read music papers. The subtext was, even if they happen to, they're so irrelevant that why bother to write about them? Did sheer cussedness dictate that I would still be writing about women making fascinating music almost 50 years on? Cool, blimey. No, or not that alone. I want to share the wonder and sheer exaltation of recognition that filled me when I first heard Polystyrene of X-Ray Specs shout, "Oh, bondage, up yours!" In those more vanilla days, I knew at once that, with all its saucy frisson, the bondage she sang about was not S&M. Rather, it was the patriarchy that I had just started hearing about, since feminism had started to filter through just a couple of years previously. Yes, and now here I was witnessing this strange apparition. I was in a London club, and this was such a shock. To this day, I really remember it. I was walking to the front of the stage, and there was on the stage a long-haired guitarist in jeans, who, as I drew closer, I realized was a woman. Yeah, for real. I had never ever seen a woman perform on stage before, although I was already a music journalist. Yes, and so I published my first Women in Rock story, which, as you can see, would not be my last. Pop and rock had actually only existed for about a quarter of a century, thus making it easy to become an expert. It would have been hard then to imagine that I would turn out to be a music lifer in this room altogether, thinking about these issues, yeah. So that was how and where it all began. And you see now why, as I say in this book, our revenge, it's not a sort of mean-spirited gotcha type of thing. Our revenge is our complex survival when people have been trying to block us for many years. And I think people in this room, am I speaking to anybody who understands?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. So, incidentally, so in this book, it's structured around themes, those themes being identity, money, love/unlove, and protest. And it's built around playlists that you can actually hear anytime you want for nothing on Spotify. Although unless you're really good with Spotify, if you do use the Spotify while you're reading the book, you may have to shuffle the order, which is unfortunate. But it's all there. And so I address these different songs, and I talk about Blondie's Rip Her to Shreds, which I'm sure many of you remember. And then I move on to a group that helped build this house we're standing in now, which is the Raincoats.
Yay.
Many people here love the Raincoats, right?
Yeah.
So, the polished pastiche unsisterhood of Rip Her to Shreds is the conceptual flip side of the Raincoats' No One's Little Girl, which is happily shambolic by conventional standards. Opening with soft yelps, the track delights in toying with a voice, sometimes singing in a whisper, where the power of volume had always been more prized, calling on us to listen differently. The blurry saw of Vicky Aspinall's fiddle enhanced the track's mysterious tug. This faux softness was subversive, undercutting the foundation of people's expectations of how women could or should sound in music. The band illuminated a new register and a perspective that was defiantly feminist. The New Yorkers of Blondie could be wittily nostalgic for the 1950s, while the Raincoats were born to kick against that conformist decade in which uncomfortable corsets and tight, pointy-toed stiletto heels were not a fun style choice or even a fetish, but a daily dressing necessity. There was definitely a 1950s vibe in my parents' heads, reflected bassist Gina Birch. My mum was mostly a housewife. She wanted for me the things she knew were good for herself. Nice party dresses with silver party shoes, curls though my hair was dead straight, to be girly and dance around the living room for aunties to Swan Lake. It was secure in its own way. But my mother did not have a lot of friends. She was a bit oppressed, then a bit depressed. Birch and her father were very close, but he disliked her bringing feminist books back from the library in case they gave her mother ideas. Birch wanted more, though she was not sure what that more could consist of. She says, boys were encouraged to be what we would like to be. The life assigned to boys was more adventurous, exciting, and challenging. We girls thought we'd like to have a bit of that, she recalls. It's not simple though, because boys also might want to have more enjoyment of, quote, womanly things, cooking, gardening, nurturing. But it did seem a bigger step for women to find adventures. Then I saw the Slits. Seeing the Slits transformed Gina and energized her into starting the Raincoats. And then I'd go on to talk a bit about punk and reggae in West London. Then it says, in this open climate, Birch found her community, including me, and was empowered to write the song, No One's Little Girl. She says, up until I came to London, I was always part of a partnership. I had to have a boyfriend. That was the rule imported from the outside world, which I internalized. Every time I had one, I always entered their zone. They wouldn't enter mine. I would get consumed and lose touch with my girlfriends. Suddenly, I realized I didn't need that validation, and it felt very liberating. I think the song No One's Little Girl was a fuck you to all of that. Yes. So one last little bit, and then, yeah. One of the aspects of this book that was very, very, very important to me, a lot of people just really try and dismiss punk and say it's been commodified and it has no force. But punk is a gateway to making music. Many women don't have musical mentors or musical role models. Punk is a sort of natural first step. And I knew that just as it had been very liberating for me personally, that it was still fulfilling that function today. And I felt that all this diminishing of punk and saying it only happened if you were like in 100 yards of CBGBs or the sun in splendour on the Portobello Road, I felt that was I felt that was far from the whole story. So I did know of some, but I did also, that's why the book took a long time, really set out to find the state of play. I wanted many women's voices and see how punk, you know, the role it was playing in their lives and their art. And I was sort of hoping that I would find quite a surprising mix of thoughts, and yet at the same time, through these themes, try and touch on and to summon what binds us all. And I end the book on a group. It took me an awfully long time to find them, and I don't really speak Spanish. An even longer time to interview them with the help of intermediaries. But that band, sort of life-changing band, they're from Colombia, South America. It was an amazing country, as some of you may know, and yet I know a lot of you know that it's a very tormented country too, because its very blessings have become a sort of curse, you know, like from the ceviche, which we all now love, and the depleted fish stocks, to really the mountain peasant's friend of cocaine that has led to so many disappeared people in Colombia, so much bloodshed, as we all know. And I was thinking, gosh, you know, I bet in Colombia there's some women who've been finding punk has been helping lift them and their communities. And actually, welcome to Fertile Miseria, who are a collective, and I talk about their song, Visiones de la Muerte, Visions of Death. You can see the video on YouTube. And it was an amazing experience talking to them. And they are a mixed band, you know, gender-wise, but they were founded by two sisters, Vicky and Piedad Castro, and they were sort of known as almost the first girl punks in Colombia, and they're still at it today. And they're so serious, you know, with their politics and their approach that when I was first trying to speak to them, you couldn't just speak to them, they had to have, and this is actually just like the original roots of Rough Trade as it happens, they had to have a collective meeting to decide, you know, if they were going to speak to me and what they would answer. So later I got to talk to them a bit more directly, but here at this point they say via a group collective email, Fertile Miseria has been around since 1990, screaming with pain and anger at the injustice that is seen in our country. In addition to the drug war we had to live through with Pablo Escobar, this increased scourge of guerrilla and paramilitary factions caused the group of displaced people in our country to grow every day. Incidentally, one of the band actually was kidnapped. He was one of those disappeared. He was bundled into the trunk in what they call the car of death. That's what they call it in Colombia. And they didn't know they would ever get him back, but they were lucky that they did. You know, and in the video, there's a guy, he's been shot. He's on the operating table and it's touch and go. But the twist is that in the song, at the end, he doesn't even know whether he wants to come back to life. You know, it's a very, very existential. As they write, the dying man and all the lyrics reflect the desperation, the fear, the pain, the rage that the people and relatives of victims of violence feel. And even the conformity that leads us to decide that it is better to be dead than to live this crude reality. But I think we'll all agree it's a little bit different from Richard Hell saying no future in the comfort of London. These things have served us in that they've made Fertile Miseria create blunt, aggressive and challenging music and lyrics. We took our guitars and downloaded all this horror and fear which is reflected in our lyrics. So thank you for listening to me. I'm going to go into the Q&A with Zoe now, and I hope you'll take a moment to listen to the playlists, and I hope you realise even from what Fertile Miseria is saying, yeah, it ain't over for punk and girls.
I don't think you need a host really, Viv. I'm quite happy to just listen to you talk. It's fabulous. One more time for Viv Goldman. I love those readings and I love that music. Viv and you as well. There we are. Take a seat. So, yes, just to introduce myself, for those who don't know me, my name is Zoe Howe, and I first met Vivian Goldman 10 years ago. Exactly, for the, I was working on the biography of the Slits, which is Tibble Girls, and, and there's lots of lovely people in this room who I met for the first time through that book, so it was a very special experience, as we sort of kept in touch since then. So this book is of special interest to me, and I know it is to everybody here. And just a few reflections really on this fabulous book, Revenge of the She-Punks. I mean, it's as you say, it's, you know, it's a kind of, well, it's a distillation, isn't it? I mean, you say you've been working on it for 2 years, but really it's a really potent distillation of a life's work, and, you know, partly a memoir, as we learn about U2, and when I say U2, I of course mean yourself, and not the Irish band with the same name. You're definitely not She-Punks, but there's that memoir element to it as well. But it's a very kind of potent distillation, and it's precious knowledge, and I think now of all times, you know, we're feeling this sort of, we're in this era of kind of rising female energy, and we're in this era of Me Too and Time's Up and false consciousness and pussy grabbing presidents, and, you know, we need this book more than ever, I think. So thank you for writing it.
Thanks ever so much for understanding and appreciating. You know, I'm a Londoner, formerly of Henrietta Barnett School and the Finchley Road, if anybody here knows North West London, before West London, you know. But then I did move to New York for kind of for good or real. But I have to say, you know, here is very kind of messed up feeling with a lot of confusion in the air, because are we in Brexit, are we not? So there's this, it's even a different feeling from the anarchy that John Lydon talked about at the time. But in America, it's so extremely heavy. You know, I think, in a way, people like us, maybe we were naive at the time we were making things like Rock Against Racism. I actually thought, as a child of refugees myself, how could I have been that dumb? I thought we'd done the work, and that people weren't going to do, like, mass murders and genocide and that sort of, you know, making people into second-class citizens and then trying to get rid of them. I thought that was done, but how wrong was I? And now, I don't know if you're aware of what's going on in Alabama, in America, in the South, which is a different country, but, you know, they're rolling back rights that my big sisters fought for. Things I thought were really sorted, women's rights over their own bodies and so on. But no, it seems like the struggle really continues over and over again. So if there's any particularly young people out there, get ready, because that's what it's like apparently. Anyway, yeah, Alabama is a nightmare.
I mean, this is one of the things I find particularly interesting and important about your writing, Vivian, is that you put everything in a social context and a political context as well. It's a very kind of rounded view of what's going on, and I should also add as well, those of you who haven't read the book yet, it does take us through history up to today. You know, there are groups such as Big Joni and Pussy Riot and the kind of issues they face reflected in this book as well. But, I mean, it's an incredibly intense amount of information that you have distilled into this book. But, I mean, when did you decide you wanted to collate all of this and put it out now? Why now?
Well, here's a funny thing. I didn't really decide at all. Typical of me, maybe. But what happened was, it was a revival of interest in my music that led to this book. And, you know, as I was saying, it's a zeitgeist thing. People are seeking out the voices of women that were, like, sort of quashed and sidelined. And so a little company in France, Stabgold, approached me to ask if they could reissue my old music. And, you know, it got this incredible wave of interest and headlines, amazing positive response, you know. And Pitchfork magazine in America decided to do a women's punk article, and they approached me. They voted my song Private Armies, that I sang earlier, as one of the top feminist punk songs, but only in recorded history. Anyway, and they asked me to write a little thing. And as I was thinking, well, what can I write about this massive topic in like 150 words? And I remember thinking I wanted to write something to really rally the troops and encourage women, don't be defeated, give it a go, just like the boys feel it's their birthright. It really should be ours too, it is, claim it. And they loved what I wrote at the University of Texas Press. It was like that story about Lana Turner sitting in the soda fountain in Los Angeles, and somebody comes in and says, so literally they contacted me, they said, do you want to write a book about women and punk? And I was like, actually I had my mind set on other things, but you know what? This is too big an opportunity. I realised I really had a lot to say, and that I also felt like I know many others in this community, like I think Helen McCookery sitting somewhere, she's done a lot of work in this area with her book The Lost Women of Rock, focusing on England and South and Brighton as well is a specialty of that area of that book. And you know, I just wanted to be a voice in that debate and help sort of build a bridge, because really that bridge had been dynamited behind us so many times. That's why I remember when Chicks on Speed approached me in the early 90s wanting to do this women's compilation album. They were like, oh, we somehow came across your name, but we thought we were doing it all for the first time. And that, of course, is always nice to do things for the first time, but what does that really mean? It's actually like good and reassuring to know that you're not the only lone loony. You know, there is a her story. Women have been out there trying to make their voices heard for years in, you know, in an industry. And this is, I'm not at all anti-men, I'm not separatist. It's just that the men in control in the music industry had a very reductive view of what they deem like fuckable and thus sellable. Just a particular, often very Aryan type, certainly in the white area, you know, and that's where people like polystyrene smash the mold, you know. So I just really hope that this will be an encouragement to people who want to make music in the future, people particularly of the female persuasion.
I think we do need to keep hearing these stories as well, because as you say, the bridges do keep being burnt behind us. That's such a good way of putting it. And I mean, you know, it's an issue close to my heart as a musician, as a female musician. As you say, why aren't male musicians called male musicians? They're just musicians, aren't they? But I mean, it still feels like today we have to justify ourselves. You know, we still have to. You know, it's a girl band, it's a female drummer, and you know, I always think of this. I mean, it kind of. You have to have a sense of humour about it, but you know, I remember turning up to a gig with my drums, and this chap saying, "Oh, you know, are you the singer?" I was like, "Well, guess again. I'm holding drums," you know. And he said, "Oh, you're the drummer. Oh, I'll show you a thing or two." So I said, "Oh, well, do you know how to play drums?" And he said, "No." And I thought, wow, that tells you so much, doesn't it? You don't play the drums, but you still think you're better than me.
But that's actually because he's got a dick. That's what gave him that impression. You know, yeah, there are a lot of stories in the book, not even all of which I could put in, like women saying to me, you know, the sound engineer just not believing they can play, and then when they hear them play and they hear them play really well, they get pissed off, you know, because it sort of threatens that argument. I mean, a lot of lovely men here are my close friends from my whole life. They're cool people. I know they don't get threatened by this sort of talk because they know that they're not those sort of guys, thank heavens. There are, you know, many guys beside us in the struggle. Like, for example, Youth, who I've dubbed one of the girls. Youth is officially one of the girls now.
What a compliment that is as well. I mean, one of the things I picked up on, you know, from one of the more sort of personal reflections in the book, you were talking about your kind of college years, and you said that Jermaine Greer was your tutor, but I mean, what comes across to me is you're already, you know, you're living as a feminist would. Maybe, I don't know if you were identifying as a feminist, but it sort of brought me on to thinking about that kind of fact that so many punky women didn't really seem to want to take on the feminist tag, even to this day, still kind of shy away from that word. Why do you? Why?
Because they want to get laid.
Oh, fair enough.
And they think that guys will be put off if they say they're feminists.
Okay.
But that's not necessarily the case. The cool guys will still want to shag you. And then when I talk to women about that, and I say, but they say, oh no, I'm not a feminist. And then I say, well, let me ask you one thing. Do you believe in equal pay for women? Not one woman has said no. So I say, hey, if you believe in equal pay between the genders, you're a feminist.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. I mean, do you think that feminism, the word feminism seems to mean something different today to what it did in the 70s? Do you think, you know, there was a sort of almost a stigma around the word feminism in the 70s that there isn't now?
I don't know, I think you're absolutely right. I think that a lot of women still feel that stigma. And I really think it just does come down to that popularity contest thing.
Yes.
They don't want to be dismissed as sort of screaming harpies. And that's why sometimes still women are scared of the word. But at the time when punk began, you know, and as I talk about in the book, you know, feminism, the whole idea was still very new. You look at somebody like Janis Joplin, and you think it would have been so nice for her if she'd have had some feminist sisters, you know, who was feeling dissed by all the guys who didn't think, you know, she was sexy in their reductive terms. That used to depress her and bring her down. But if she'd had some sort of bolshy feminist sisters, she might have been with us today. I often think that.
That's a really interesting point. It also sort of brings me kind of neatly on to something else you mentioned, which I thought was really interesting. It's important for us all to remember, I think especially people who weren't around at the time, that, you know, it would be wrong to kind of present it as if it's only because of the she-punks that, you know, a woman would pick up an instrument. Obviously you had people like Carol Kays, you talked about Stevie Nicks, Gladys Knight, but what is it about punk that really emboldened people? Was it the sort of accessibility of it or the urgency of it?
But like you just say, Carol Kay, she was like the woman who played bass with Motown, but there was none other than Carol Kay. And then you mentioned a couple of singers, Stevie Nicks, who was a textbook fitting the template of what they wanted a woman to be. So it was always okay to be singer-songwriters. The difference was with punk was the collective aspect of women forming bands, and even women forming bands with guys, but their voices were unfiltered. They didn't have to please a very reductive, again, and patriarchal industry. And like, you know, I've been mentioning my big sister Judy, right, who's that subtle few years older than me. Some of you in the audience know Judy Salvage. Anyway, she still moans at me to this day. She was like, oh, you had it easy, because when, you know, when I was your age, a woman, and this is true, a woman could not buy a house. A woman could not sign for a car. A woman couldn't do anything till the legislation came in the early 70s, just as punk was happening. You know, and what's more, if your husband was beating you up, you had no legal recourse until the early 1970s. So punk and that feeling of, yes, a woman can reside in her power and not always inevitably be a victim, that was also part of the zeitgeist. And I think, you know, Jeff Travis was of Rough Trade, was somebody who was very influential in opening doors for women with his label, you know, Rough Trade. But he was, and still is, one of what they were calling then new men, you know, men who were formed by the ideas of feminism and were strong enough in their manhood not to feel threatened by it. That's all that it takes, is not to feel insecure in your manhood, for guys to be completely allies and part of our community.
Absolutely, and I suppose another chap that springs to mind, and I know someone that you've worked with is called Keith Levine, who was very kind of, you know, enabled the Slits to do a lot. And he said something really interesting to me that kind of stayed with me. He said, you know, it mattered that they were girls, but it also really mattered that it didn't matter that they were girls. That's great.
Nice, that's nice. Keith Levine, who plays actually bass on My Private Armies,
that's
that we
right.
just heard, yeah. That's a nice thing of him. I like he said that.
Yeah, no, he was a very kind of you know, he was very kind of supportive, and you kind of come to treasure those guys, you know.
Yeah, well, in fairness, John Lydon was a real ally. You know, without him, I would have never made that record Laundrette. It's because of him that Keith Levine, plays on the record. So I've got to give him respect. John Lydon of Public Image Limited, yeah.
Because you were quite involved with the sort of the Gunter Grove scene, were you? Were you sort of socialising?
Yes, I have to say.
Another book in that, I think.
Those crazy hazy days at Gunter Grove. Yes, I think we'll leave that for when we have another meeting at the pub, sort of thing. Yeah, it's a separate. It was intense times, and with the great Jeanette Lee, who is now a partner in Rough Trade, And John Lydon had the wisdom to not be threatened by her, but bring her into his camp.
Yes, of course, in Public Image Limited. Just a sort of random question, but one that sort of comes up occasionally. I always think it's quite a strange question. But sometimes I get asked, what's the difference between a boy sound and a girl sound in a band? And I thought you would be the perfect person to ask.
It's so poignant. It always sort of tugs at me when I think of that, because at the time, like that very early 76 things, maybe even in that same article, I wrote something like, what would women sound like if women had the chance to make their own music their way? I wonder what it would sound like. When I wrote that, we didn't even know, And then, to me, people like the Slits and the Raincoats with a very different spatial sense and, very free aspects, that seemed to me to be a kind of womanly, as it were, contribution to pop. And yet, honestly, when I listened to that Sharon Signs to Cherry Red not long ago, it really made me think. I was like, gosh, all sorts of us making all sorts of things. I mean, it's true that somebody like Chrissie Hynde, she wanted to be a rocker. She wanted to be a rock star. Susie Quattro, she wanted to make rock. She wanted to rock with the boys. And if you listen to some of those compilations, you'll hear actually females doing all sorts of music if they get the opportunity. So personally, I will always feel there was a particular sort of estrogen type contribution with a shifting sensibility, not so dominated by Four on the Floor. And yet that is just one part of women's musical creativity.
Totally.
I'm very involved. I've always been very involved with Jamaica. I got to work with Bob Marley for many years and so on. And when I was writing the book, sometimes I get very upset, like almost tearful. And I was thinking about how some of us in this room, our lives were so shaped by the artistry of people like the great Dennis Brown, who himself pushed women's music forward in England with Lovers Rock on his DEB label. But, Dennis, Gregory, not only Bob Marley, all the great master singers. And then as I was writing it hit me, but where were the girls? Unless you were literally fucking the producer or a blood relative of the producer, you weren't in the studio unless you were, mixing up the ganja tea. Yeah. So, and that does apply across the board. And maybe it's starting to change now.
I hope so. I mean, that does remind me of a story that Ariel told me for the Slits book, which is quite amusing, but very much reflects what you're saying. Well, when they were making their cover of I Heard It Through the Grapevine at the Island Studio, and they kind of got completely left, they were just sort of left them to it, really, and they came to kind of starting to mix the track, and they were just, there was this kind of tea lady who said, well, I kind of spend time in the studio. I've observed how the mixing desk works. So they kind of, between themselves and the lady who made the tea, they mixed this absolutely classic cover version, possibly the best, cover of I Heard It Through the Grapevine ever. And it's just, and again, it's this, maybe it is a female sound, but it's very free. And maybe it does kind of reflect the fact that we aren't linear. We are different, we work on cycles, don't we? We ebb and flow. We're not, as you say, we don't necessarily relate to that Four to the Floor thing, but it also doesn't mean that we can't do it.
Yes. Yeah. That's a great story. Thanks for sharing that with us. Thanks to Zoe. Yeah.
Well, thanks to Ari, for sharing. But it's just sort of very reflective of these lovely things that just happen by accident sometimes, and they can often be the gold, can't they? And there's a lovely line that you put in your book, and I think you quoted it earlier, where you mentioned that the Raincoats challenged us to listen differently, and they're sort of playing with how they use sound, and they're kind of quite subversive in that they kind of, they'll whisper when you expect them to shout, and it sort of turns the whole punk thing on its head, that you expect they'll be kind of like very aggressive all the time, rah rah rah. They are that's very punk in itself, isn't it? It's subversive.
Well, punk is about reinvention in a fresh way, and expressing yourself in a sort of untrammeled way. These days, I think you all know what I mean. People are banging on about identity, aren't they? There's an obsession with identity. Identity this, identity that. It's useful because it's always nice to know where you come from, so it's not like I'm dismissing it entirely. But I want to just restate here that one of the great glories of punk was the ability to carve up your own identity and not be burdened in a way, as is so often the case with whatever Holocaust, it was your family saga. Do you see what I mean? Whatever trauma or tragedy or even the elations of the past, to say, no, I'm going to do it differently. I'm going to find a way just to express myself and my community and my society. I don't need to be defined by the generations that came before me in my exact DNA line. Don't we all find that somewhat freeing?
100%, completely liberating. But we need to sort of hear these stories, and it's so valuable that that books like this exist, because we need to hear these stories and share these stories and keep that line going, because not everybody has those examples around them. And it was an interesting, I can't remember who it was who was talking about it in the book, but it might have been Viv Albertine, talking about the kind of, the lack of role models, but also not necessarily needing a role model. And I felt like that when I was growing up. I didn't know of any other, I didn't know about the Slits back then, but I sort of didn't feel, I had to do it. I just had to play the drums. I didn't need permission. But the people who did need those people to look to were actually the people around you, because they didn't have that frame of reference, and so they were like, oh, girls playing the drums, no, doesn't compute. And so we kind of need those people to seep into mainstream consciousness.
Yes, it can be encouraging. That's why I wrote the book. But at the same, equally, we need to know that to give us a platform and know we're not just dancing on empty air. But at the same time, we're dancing in the knowledge that we're reinventing ourselves and our communities. Hopefully, that's our aim.
Absolutely. One of the things I really love about the way the book is written is that you can tell that it's actually written by, obviously, a writer, but also a musician. There's a kind of musicality to the way you write. There's a kind of a rhythm and a melody to the prose, which is kind of really beautiful, and I think reflects that you are a musician as well as a writer as well, and those two things go hand in hand. But one of the things I wanted to ask you is what came first for you? Was it music or was it writing?
Well, really, music for me was something we did, in the family, and we all used to sing together, like I say in the book. And it didn't ever occur to me to be a musician. I was really freed by punk and by having that community, the Slits, Nena Cherry, the Raincoats, the Modettes, everybody, that was around. Suddenly, because I was writing a bit on the music press before punk, and there really weren't any girls. I was lucky I had Caroline Coon on the Melody Maker, but there was nobody else apart from that. And it was such a change. Before then I'd got to interview Stevie Nicks and Gladys Knight and the great Annette Peacock, jazz musician. Very few women to interview, though. And it was like a tidal wave that lifted me up of the women of punk. And I don't know, actually, because I was always like singing around, so people did used to, actually the first time I went in the studio, not many people know this because I never really talk about it, but it was with the Wailers, with Tyrone Downey was doing a solo album that was never released, and he was the first person to ask me in the studio, so that was my first recording experience. But then I did a lot of reggae backup singing, often with Ari and Nena Cherry, and that was Adrian Sherwood used to use me a lot, as it were. And then David Cunningham asked me to join the Flying Lizards, and then I got sort of, I suppose, more unserious or serious about it, or that I started to have some real experience. But no, until punk, I also was a person who didn't think music was for girls, as it were. And then after I'd had my band Chantage in Paris, a duo with F. Blois, and for personal reasons, I was going to move us to London, but she couldn't come. And then I was offered work in the exciting world of 1980s independent television. So I was like, yeah. you know, I'll always love music and doing music, but it didn't look too promising as a terrain for a woman in her 30s to be getting into music, because it was just so unwelcoming, you know. And I had, you know, so I was excited, and I said to myself, you know, I'll always be a musician inside, and I'll always be able to sing, you know, and then nobody can take that away from me. I'll have that my whole life. Now I'm going to go and work in television, you know. But this is partly because of all the themes we explore in the book, you know. And yeah, this is why I'm so grateful to punk. You can see, without punk, I would have maybe never been able to express myself. And it's given me some pleasure, and apparently it's given you some pleasure, and hopefully some people in this room. So I'll always be grateful. That's why I sat down to write the book.
And it definitely, you can see how it has sort of fed into all these areas of your life and kind of, you know, lit different things up at different times. It's always informed by it. And another name that comes up in the book that I must mention, I know that Helen McCookery-Book, who's here, wrote about her in Lost Women of Rock, is Vice Versa, a name that you don't hear very often, but she is in these two wonderful punk books, rock and roll books, resplendent, joyous, tough, and so brave on so many levels. And again, another person who I suppose, you know, punk gives her this sort of open door to sort of be her best self and kind of almost not transcend herself, but become herself. Let's talk a little bit about Vice Versa for those who aren't aware.
Well, Vice Versa, you know, she smashed many of those old barriers. She was a polymath as an artist herself, and she only started doing music in her 40s, but she became, you know, very much a den mother for the whole Brighton scene, as Helen chronicles in her book, The Lost Women of Rock. And she was very, very political. And in the book, I bracket her. I never met Vi, unfortunately. Although, funny enough, we share sort of slightly similar backgrounds, but I never did meet her. And, you know, she was allied with Crass, and in fact funded Crass's first recordings. But I ally her in the book with a woman who I was super close to, who was really my mentor as an artist, and like every time I do anything I think of her, and that is Jane Cortez, who's all too little known. She was a poet, and she was a true punk in the sense that, you know, she had her own publishers, she set up her own gigs. In the end, she set up serious women writers' conferences for the African diaspora that were held at NYU. And she was also spoken word, and her band, the Fire Spitters, doubled up with Ornette Coleman's band. She was, when they were young, married to Ornette Coleman, so her ideas are really implicit in the idea of harmonics. And they shared musicians, and they shared a very similar percussive, blunt style where they used repetition to really force ideas into the listener's head. And I urge you really to go and listen to the playlists in case you haven't heard Vice Versa and Poison Girls and Jane Cortez and the Fire Spitters. And it's interesting that they have that shared aesthetic. So I grouped them together, and I'm curious to see if you agree with me. Yeah.
I must say thank you for those playlists, by the way. I mean, it's fabulous to kind of have that and have, you know, to be able to kind of refer to the music and have you as our guide, you know, as we read this book. It's lovely, and it's just such a touchstone, as I say. So it's, you know, I urge you all to buy a copy. I'm aware time is rolling on. So does anybody have a question for Viv and the audience?
Q&A.
I don't know if there's a roving mic, as they say.
I'll share
just
my mic.
Shout.
In punk style, I'll share my mic. Has anybody got a question? Should I think of a question for you? Having spent a
What
lot
would
of
you
time
ask
having to
yourself,
think of
Viv?
questions.
You could ask yourself a question.
Somebody, Disco Dale, have you got a question? Who's got?
I wish I
Yes.
I just wondered how.
Do you want the mic?
I can yeah. I just wondered if you were in the time when you first started like playing bands, if you were so honestly going out all the time to gigs and trying to like completely submerge yourself in what was going on, with the time, and was it always disappointing that you were mostly seeing men in music?
It was a little hard to hear you, but you're saying was it disappointing you only saw guys in bands, you mean?
No, like when you...
Please feel free to
When you first were involving yourself in music before the journalism, and then after, of course, going out to lots of gigs, you would have gone to a lot of things.
Yeah.
You would have experienced a lot of different gigs and music, and I guess nights that were put on. And I just wondered that when you were doing that and you were immersing yourself in that sort of scene and everything, was it, were you feeling at the time disappointed that you were only seeing mostly men in music, or were there moments where you went, oh my God, there's a night that puts on only women? I don't know.
Yeah.
I try to do that as often as I can, but it
You
depends.
do that? You
Well, I
on
put a
nights?
night on, but we have a night where we have all women in the bands, for one of them especially, and then we have every month we try and make sure there's at least a female musician or a female singer in one of the bands that we put on.
Yeah.
But I do think that it gets difficult in the sense that if you go out looking for, to see music all the time, which I love going to live stuff all the time, I still love a night when it's all boys. It doesn't make me feel disappointed, but at your time when you were going, it must have felt quite strange to never
I
see
also
one.
hadn't, like I was writing first. I wrote for many years before I started to really do music. And that was just the state of the game, that it was 99.99% men. And that's what I was trying to say, that with the advent of punk, that's when I saw things shift. Like the bit I wrote in 1976, literally, I'd seen acres of bands by then, but I'd never seen a woman musician. So that was a bit of a seismic cultural shift, but it's interesting to hear. Where is your night? Where is it?
I just do an independent night, and it's a bunch of us girls night, and it's in Bow.
In Bow?
It's in Bow. It's called DIY Thursday. We always put our flyers up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Watch out for her flyers. Yeah, that's why punk was an earthquake, for me and for a generation, that you would start to see some females, then, and not before.
What about women? What about singer-songwriters? What about all the great singer-songwriters? They're all musicians.
Yes, what I was saying was, hello, well, there's Chris. Yeah, and who's, introduce yourself, and he's in the book. He's in the book.
Well, Chris Bond.
Yay! And he's in the book. He helped me a lot with the Berlin section. Thank you very much. You're quoted and cited and credited.
But I was just thinking about people like Buffy St. Reed, who's making an electronic album in 1969.
Yeah, no, I'm saying that was accepted, but when punk came along was the first time you would see like women in bands and singer-songwriters and the folky thing. That was a permitted area, like in the record industry it was permitted for a woman to be a PR or a secretary, but not an A&R, So yes, that was the acceptable face of female music, what you're describing. So what about them? Thank goodness, thank the goddess they existed. I'm saying that punk brought in a bit of a new paradigm.
Yeah, but again, without, I like Buffy St. Reed very much, but somebody making an electronic album in 1969, coming from that scene, was doing something very, very different. So there
that
were,
was very forward thinking of her.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's not to dismiss, obviously not to dismiss.
But you take the basic point.
I do take the basic point. So, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks for coming, Chris Bone, legendary music writer.
Have we got time for one more question before the signing? Anybody else got a question for Viv? Lady in the middle.
What about, lady?
Did someone pass that? Thank you.
Oh, it's a little short. I'm gonna come
Approach the bench.
Hi.
Hello.
I wanted to get your thoughts on the commodification of feminism. As you were saying earlier about how young women are concerned with being fuckable and therefore don't want to call themselves a feminist. As an American girl, growing up, I definitely was an outlier in calling myself a feminist. Nobody wanted to be that. Everyone was worried about being attractive and not being like a feminazi, things like that. Now, though, I see with young women and women my age, like in their early 30s, is actually we're just being sold feminism now, and that there's full like stores in New York right now that are selling T-shirts, and everything is just about buying shit, you know, to be a feminist, and that like men are also engaging, I think, to the opposite point of like they want to get laid by wearing shorts that say the future is female, and you know it's like it's the other side of the coin because money's now gotten involved.
Yeah.
So feminism is cool, but now it's like fluffy, you know.
Fabulous question. And you know, I was talking earlier about people turning their back on punk because of the commodification of punk. Well, guess what? Everything does get commodified, but is there an intense, bright, shiny flame at the center of it that can't be extinguished, you know, which is that urge for a sort of liberty? So I think we have to barrel on through the commodification because, you know, everything does get commodified, but that doesn't alter the fact that even though for some people it's a fad and a fashion they'll pick up and put down and try and make some money out of for a minute, but the issue is still there and the need is still there. So certain of us have to still hover around the front line and keep on confronting in whichever area. Makes me think of punk actually, because you know, back in the day my pride and joy was this pair of leopard skin trousers that I'd got in LA at this clothing, you know, Hollywood clothing shop. But now you go into any shop, don't you, and get leopard skin everything. But does that mean that, you know, the leopard, you know, animal prints and their traditional connection with punk, is it absolutely defanged? No, at the end of the day, we're still, hello, our lady there in her neon zebra print. No, at the end of the day, we still have to keep pushing on in our animal prints and really standing up for what we believe in, even if other people are trying to make money from it. It doesn't mean that the issue's not real. By the way, a friend of mine, just had Pride in New York, and a couple of friends of mine, including Jeanette Beckman, the great photographer, and also Jill Cuniff of Luscious Jackson, they went on a march that was a sort of because they said the Pride has got so commodified that people were doing a Pride march because it's Bloomingdale's and everybody was Pride this and Pride that. Commodified, but what was the real need? So people were doing a rebel march with no sponsorship. Pride. Yeah. Any more for any more? Eager faces in the back.
I think maybe now might be a good time to say, 'cause it's probably time for a signing, isn't it? So I guess that's going to be happening over here. Let's say a huge thank you to the wonderful Vivian Goldman. It's a fabulous book, guys. Fantastic.
Thanks to you all for turning up. Thanks to Zoe. Thanks to Youth, one of the girls. That's fine. Yay! Yeah. If anybody wants to buy a book, I'll be lurking over there with my signing hand flexed. Yeah. Thanks very much.
They've locked the doors. That no one can leave unless they bought a book. The doors are locked now.
Thank you.